probably speaks to a decision by Kyiv to be a little bit more risk-acceptant in how they position their surface air missile systems. Of course, like I said, it comes with risks. There have been some Russian strikes on Ukrainian SAM systems in recent weeks, perhaps as a result of that decision.
These rates of losses might be because Russia is actually using more planes.
It has allowed them to kind of increase their activity, I think, around Avdiivka in particular. Before the Ukrainian withdrawal, the rate of bombing was just very, very intense.
Will that have like a real operational effect? Hi everyone, and welcome to This Week in Ukraine, a show where the newsroom of the Kyiv Independent explains Ukraine's biggest events in just under 30 minutes. I'm your host, Anastasiia Lapatina. Today, we will talk about how Ukraine has allegedly managed to down an unprecedented number of Russian planes, 15 in the last month, and what that says about Russian and Ukrainian air capabilities going forward. I'm joined by John Hardie, the Deputy Director of the Russia Program at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Mr. Hardie, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So, according to President Volodymyr Zelensky and his speech on March 3rd, since the beginning of February, so in the last month, basically, Ukraine has allegedly downed 15 Russian planes, 7 of them in a week. And these are numbers that are making a lot of headlines because I remember the time when just one Russian plane being destroyed or damaged was a huge cause of celebration, and it was really rare. But before we get into those reports and, talk about them, can you just walk us through the mechanics of how a plane actually goes down? Like, what kind of weapons is Ukraine using and has been using to do that throughout the war?
To shoot down a Russian aircraft, Ukraine will use a surface-to-air missile system, something like a Patriot or S-300, Buk. There are a bunch of different systems Ukraine inherited from the Soviet Union and received from Western nations. I should note that not all of those 15 shoot-downs have been confirmed, but a significant number have. It seems that Ukraine has shot down a spree of Russian aircraft. Some were actually down by the Russians themselves. I think the Russians have a significant friendly fire problem. But I think the number that Ukraine has shot down probably speaks to a decision by Kyiv to be a little bit more risk-acceptant in how they position their surface-to-air missile systems. That decision comes with its own risks, as I said. But I think obviously someone in Kyiv believes it's necessary to counter Russian bombing, which, as you know, has been quite devastating.
Okay, so there are three types of Russian aircraft that Ukraine says it downed, which is the Su-34, Su-35, and A-50. Can you tell us just a little bit about what kind of planes those are and why that's significant?
So the Su-35 is a multi-role fighter, 4++ generation, as the Russians would say. The Su-34 is a fighter bomber, really the primary aircraft that Russia uses to drop the UMPK-equipped bombs. These are the bombs, dumb bombs with a pop-out wing kit that offers a measure of guidance, although they're still fairly inaccurate. The A-50 is an airborne early warning control aircraft, sort of a eyes-in-the-sky aircraft. Its loss is particularly significant, likely as a result of Russian friendly fire. But it's the second one in recent weeks that has been down by Russian friendly fire, and the Russians really don't have very many left. So they're at a place of vulnerability with regard to those aircraft.
Well, the big question is, how is Ukraine actually managing to do this, right? Because we didn't used to have those statistics half a year ago, even several months ago as well. So what is Ukraine or Russia doing differently? Are there any specific factors that are contributing to these kinds of rates of losses?
As I said a minute ago, I think to the extent these jets have been shot down, it probably means that heightening rate probably means Ukraine is being a bit more risk-acceptant with its positioning of its SAM systems, meaning moving them a bit closer to the front line so that they're in range of the Russian jets when they drop UMPK-equipped bombs. That UMPK system has a range of maybe 60, 70 kilometers based on statements from Ukrainian officials. So it provides, a degree of standoff range for for Russian jets to drop those bombs. So if you want to try to threaten the aircraft, you obviously have to move the surface air missile system closer. That might be what Ukraine has done to try to counter that threat. Of course, like I said, it comes with risks. There have been some Russian strikes on Ukrainian SAM systems in recent weeks, perhaps as a result of that decision. Although, again, it's unclear from open sources exactly what's going on.
I've seen some experts also saying that these rates of losses might be because Russia is actually using more planes, because in the beginning of the war, it was kind of, a bit scared to really go full on in terms of its air force. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, so the UNBK definitely has allowed the Russian Air Force to play a greater role than it could really since the early days of the war, because it provides that standoff range. The Russian aircraft can bomb without necessarily coming into the range of Ukrainian surface air missiles. So it has allowed them to kind of increase their activity. I think around Avdiivka in particular, before the Ukrainian withdrawal, the rate of bombing was just very, very intense and concentrated in that area. So that could provide a more target-rich environment for a Ukrainian surface air missile system if it were able to get close enough to actually have the fighter aircraft come within its envelopment or its range.
I've also read some reports and also have heard from sources of the Kyiv Independent that, we should all be a bit cautious actually about those reports and about taking them at face value. And basically people have been saying that this number, 15 in a month, can actually be inflated. Is there any evidence of that? Like, what's your assessment of this whole controversy?
Sure. So I think we know a few were shot down. We know about the A-50s for sure. We know about a couple of the other aircraft as well. I think most of that 15 number is unconfirmed, so it's hard to say one way or the other. It does seem that at times there are reports of aircraft getting shut down when they might not be. Perhaps it was just an aircraft came within the radar range and a missile was launched and there was no, target kill confirmed, but it's reported as a shootout. That's one possible explanation. You always have to be careful with official numbers in a conflict like this.
Nevertheless, how big, if those numbers are confirmed, how big of a damage are these attacks for the Russian Air Force? Because at least 15 in a month sounds like a big number, but will that have like a real operational effect?
If the 15 number is true, I think the loss of those, you have to put the A-50s in one bucket because loss of even one is a big deal. The loss of the others, while significant, it doesn't have necessarily a crippling effect on the Russian Air Force. So I think what would be significant, again, if that number is true, is the rate of loss. So if that is sustained, it quickly becomes unviable for Russia. They're going to have to change the way they're operating. Again, it's not necessarily confirmed, so I think we should be careful about making predictions about what will come next.
Can you talk a bit more about the A-50s, actually, and what kind of range are they taking into its work when they're deployed on the front line? Like, how much land are they covering as the eyes and ears of the Russian army?
Right. So typically they're staying not in Russian airspace. Again, they're the eyes in the sky. They can cue Russian fighter jets or Russian surface air missile systems toward targets. Russia inherited some from the Soviet Union. It's currently not producing new aircraft. It's upgrading old A-50s to A-50U, which has better avionics, etc. Although it's still, even that A-50U really isn't quite up to snuff of modern standards, which is why the Russians have been developing a next-gen aircraft called the A-100, but it's been long delayed, in part perhaps because of Western export controls that actually dated before the full-scale invasion. So that really is a point of vulnerability for Russia. Without those aircraft, you become much more limited in finding and tracking targets.
Of course, since the very beginning of the war, Ukraine has been asking for F-16s, which, if you listen to Ukrainian officials, almost sometimes sounds like the thing that's going to let us win this war. And we've been waiting for them, and we're now training the pilots. But do you think the air war between Ukraine and Russia is actually going to change in a major way when F-16s arrive? And if so, how?
I think F-16s will help. I think it's definitely a good idea for the West in providing them. I wish we had gotten that process started sooner so that Ukraine could already have them. I don't see the F-16 as a game changer for Ukraine. The version of the F-16 and the air-to-air missile that we're going to provide are fairly old. And so they don't really have the cutting-edge capability of the type of aircraft that we're currently operating and developing. So I think they might provide a little bit of a capability upgrade for Ukraine, but they also, perhaps most importantly, provide a capacity expansion, meaning just a greater number of aircraft. So to help Ukraine replace losses and really towards the medium and long term transition away from the Soviet inherited Air Force to a Western one. That's really for Ukraine, the only viable way to continue having the Air Force is to transition towards Western aircraft, because they're not going to get any more from Russian, right?
It's been pretty clear from the beginning of the war that Ukraine has this huge vulnerability when it comes to air, because our Air Force is extremely weak, basically almost non-existent. Meanwhile, Russian Air Force has been really strong. But also in the last several months, in the last year, we've been hearing a lot about focusing on the production of drones, because that's kind of like a newer direction that the war is going into. So, we're hearing pledges about producing 1 million drones, etc. And, drone and FPV forces are now its own separate thing in the military. So the question is, of course, I understand the planes and the drones, they're doing very different things, but is there any way at all that Ukraine can maybe compensate for that air vulnerability that we have with, its heightened production of drones and so on?
Right. So in terms of the symmetrical response, Ukraine is not going to have anything like the Russian Air Force anytime soon for obvious reasons. The good thing for Ukraine is because it had a fairly robust air missile defense system forces going into the war, and because it's received more from the West, it's been able, and because Russia has failed to destroy them at scale, it's sort of a mutually denied environment in the air. As I said earlier, the UMPK, the Russian equivalent of the US JDAM-ER, has allowed the Russian Air Force to get sort of back in the game a bit in terms of fast jets. The helicopters, I think, were already doing an okay job, but in terms of fast jets, has allowed them to get back in the game a bit. But it's still, they're really limited to standoff strikes against fixed targets. Their ability to do dynamic targeting from the air is pretty limited. And there's still, you might be able to drop maybe 60 to 100 bombs a day using the UMPK, but you're not going to be able to like carpet bomb a city, for example, with just like many, many hundreds of bombs, and you're not able to go to hit, say, bridges from western to eastern Ukraine, things like that, with dumb bombs. So Ukraine still is able to hold the Russian Air Force at bay, which I think is pretty good accomplishment, and it has a significant effect on the war. I think for the West, a key challenge is sustaining Ukraine's ability to do that, meaning providing more systems and the interceptor missiles. There's the Frankenstein project where we try to integrate Ukraine's systems with Western interceptors to sustain that capability. So that's very, very important. In terms of drones, I think obviously Ukraine has done a great job with FPVs. They were the first to really adopt those at scale. Russia has caught up and perhaps surpassed a bit. I think Ukraine is still continuing to innovate at an impressive rate. The challenge is really scaling. So I hope that the creation of the unmanned systems branch will help sort of scale lessons learned and rationalize production and procurement of FPVs and other one-way attack drones. I think as Zaluzhny wrote before his dismissal, and as others have said, that's sort of a way that Ukraine can get a kind of some effects of air power on the cheap without having that standard Air Force.
Do you think any kind of breakthrough on the Ukrainian side is possible in this war without having air superiority, or even, trying to match, the capabilities that Russia has?
I think it's possible. It's certainly without the something like the U.S. Air Force, Israeli Air Force. It's challenging. I think Western militaries would struggle to operate in the way they expect to without something like the U.S. Air Force. I don't want to say it's impossible. I think there are things about the last counteroffensive that Ukraine can fix. And so, we don't want to be fatalistic, but certainly it's a challenge. But like I said, I think there are things Ukraine can do better. There are things Ukraine can learn, and so can the West. So hopefully, if we pass this, if Congress passes this next round of Ukraine aid, and we can get through this tough year and go into 2025, hopefully we can absorb those lessons learned and move on to implementation, and Ukraine can launch another counteroffensive and retake more territory. It'll be challenging. I think it can be done, though.
We're now going to be moving to the community question of today's episode. I'll remind you guys to go to kyivindependent.com/membership to subscribe to the Kyiv Independent and become a member of our community. You get really cool perks like exclusive access to events with editors, discussions, lectures, and also a chance to send us in questions before every single episode of the podcast. We try to incorporate as many of them as we can. And we actually have several questions kind of wrapped in one. So the community member is wondering how many of each major type of aircraft did Russia start the full-scale war with, and then how many do they have now, and then also which types are still in production and what are their production rates. So feel free to take this question wherever you want to take it.
Regretfully, I don't have exact numbers for each, like Su-34, Su-35 off the top of my head. I know that the initial Russian air grouping was probably around 300 fast jets at the beginning of the war. They have continued to produce. They have been censoring the footage, like so when the aircraft play in the east or that produces Su-35s, etc. The different aircraft flights, when they release footage, they censor the numbers on the aircraft, so you can't see how many. Like the videos are kind of tough to tell how many exactly produced. So we know there have been a number of batches last year. I want to say something like maybe 3-4 batches of Su-35s, Su-34s. We don't know how many are in each batch. Historically, it's like 4 per batch. I think in most videos I see like maybe 1 or 2 confirmed. So there's some, basically what I'm saying is there's some ambiguity, wiggle room in how many exactly are being produced. Regardless, I don't think they're keeping up with losses. But I think within the production and the way they've been very cautious in employing the aircraft so far, I think their air power is probably sustainable.
Which also means that they have many more planes to use in the future,
yes.
Unfortunately. Mr. Hardie, thank you so much. It was really interesting to listen to.
All right, thank you.
You can find our show on YouTube and all audio platforms every Saturday. If you like this episode, please subscribe to us and like our content wherever you're listening to the show. Go to kyivindependent.com/membership to become a member of our community and support our work. And also follow us on social media on X, Facebook, and Instagram. We'll be back next week. Thank you for watching.